Okay, so today we're going to talk a little bit about graphing trig functions, and really we're going to stay to our main two trig functions, sine and cosine. And sine and cosine, just like your linear functions and your quadratic functions, they have what we call parent functions. Just like y equals mx plus b, your parent function for your quadratic is y equals x squared. Your parent functions are kind of where you start, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And then you guys have your generic trig functions, or your generic functions, which have other variables. Well, you have your variables x and y, but you have other constants that you can substitute in and out of your main function so that it translates. It can move left and right, up or down on your x and y coordinate plane. So today we're going to talk about trig functions. It's going to be our first introduction. The next time that we get together, we can talk a little bit more in depth about where these come from and talk a little bit more about their translations. But today we're just going to stick with our general trig functions. So we have two of them. We have our sine function and our cosine function. And if you notice, both of their trig functions are given to you on your paper in front of you. You've got your sine first and your cosine second, and if you notice, they're pretty much identical. Your y's are in the same spot, obviously. Your a and b are going to be positive constants, and x we're going to consider measuring them in degrees just to make it easier for the introduction piece. So each function, there's a couple of vocab words we're going to go through before we get into actually graphing these functions, but a couple things about these graphs is each function is what we call periodic. And what periodic means is that the graph has a repeating pattern that continues indefinitely. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a minute when we look at the graphs. The shortest repeating portion is what we call a cycle. We have a horizontal length of each cycle, which we actually call a period. And the graphs on the next page, which we'll flip over in just a minute, we'll talk about the characteristics of these two trig functions. So a couple words you want to keep in mind is the word cycle, the word period, and the idea that each of these two functions, the sine and cosine, are periodic.